Have you ever looked at a Star Wars planet and wondered what it would look like in Minecraft? Because I've always wondered what the massive cityscape of Coruscant would look like in this blocky game. And coming into the new year, I decided to take a shot at building it. But little did I know, I was walking into my second biggest project ever. Looking at Coruscant, there were 3 buildings that I felt were essential to add into my build. The Jedi Temple, the Executive Office, and biggest of all, the Senate Building. Other than that, I couldn't find any official canon maps of Coruscant, so the general city layout would be largely up to me. I picked out this image as my main reference for Coruscant and hopped into a world to finally start outlining the city. I placed some circles to mark out the Senate Building and Executive Office and began placing the bases of other skyscrapers nearby. At this point, I was just eyeballing the scale, and I hadn't quite realized the true size of the city yet, but the Senate Building was still a staggering 250 blocks wide. From here, I decided to split the project into 3 stages and tackle one at a time to make it more digestible. But unfortunately for me, the first step was the hardest of them all. I had to build the surface of Coruscant. While the enormous skyscrapers tend to grab your attention, it's easy to forget about how complex the surface of the city is. The planet is covered with hundreds and hundreds of small but intricate structures, and while these wouldn't be hard to build on their own, this city was going to cover millions of blocks, and I didn't have 8 years to spend building different skyscrapers. I was immediately stumped, but I had one idea that I thought just might work. An idea that I got from trees. This is Axiom, the primary mod I use to help me with my builds. One of my favorite features in this mod is the stamp tool, which allows me to copy my tree designs and apply them to a brush, meaning I can literally paint entire forests with ease. But this tool isn't just limited to trees, you can copy literally anything into the brush. And this gave me an idea. What if I built different segments of Coruscant's surface and then applied them to the stamp tool? Instead of painting forests, I would be painting the entire surface of Coruscant with just one tool. For the surface buildings, I outlined 6 different 100 by 100 block grids to build on. I planned to cover each grid with different buildings and apply the 6 grids to the stamp tool once they were done. I figured the best way to start on one of the grids was to just place a bunch of rectangular structures to mark out different buildings. But from here, I was kind of lost on how I should continue designing these buildings. I began adding in some lines that would become indents in all of the buildings because, I don't know, it felt sci-fi-ish to me, but beyond that, I was stumped. So I instantly procrastinated by structuring the rest of the grids instead, which took a few hours. To get some ideas for how to design the buildings, I opened up LEGO Star Wars so that I could take a closer look at the surface and get some ideas. Most of the buildings were bland, but I was able to get some new ideas to spice up the building some more. I expanded on the structures of each building to make them less rectangular and bland, and once I felt that the structures were detailed enough, I gave them some proper shading and colors with Axiom, and I really liked how it was looking. Using just this one completed grid, I did a test painting of the surface of Coruscant, and it was already looking really good. So I began to tear through the 5 other grids, but it was slow work. Adding the indents into the sides of each building was very time consuming, and being distracted by the act of streaming made it slower as well. I'm streaming all of my build projects on Twitch from now on, so if you want to catch super builds like this live, my Twitch is linked in the description. Before I could start painting the different segments across the surface, something interesting came up. After somebody in my Twitch chat asked, I got curious as to whether or not there were actual canonical measurements for the Senate Building, so I decided to Google it. And what I found completely flipped my vision of this project on its head. As it turns out, the Senate Building is over 2 kilometers wide. Do you understand what that means? Every Minecraft block is exactly 1 meter wide, and because there are 1,000 meters in a kilometer, I would have to make the Senate Building 2,000 blocks wide. To put that into perspective for you, this is how big the Senate Building would be if it was 2,000 blocks wide. It is literally multiple times the size of the entire city that I had outlined so far. This is what that would look like in a default Minecraft world. And in case this still hasn't gotten the point across to you, I was basing my scale for the entire city off of how big I thought the Senate Building was. It wasn't just the Senate Building that was going to grow in size, it was literally everything. These skyscrapers that I planned to make hundreds of blocks tall would now need to be thousands of blocks tall. This just went from a fun little project to the biggest build of my entire life in a matter of a few seconds. Whoa. Sorry, I really needed to get that out of my system. Okay, so obviously we can't make the Senate building 2,000 blocks wide because I want to be able to load in the complete build without my computer catching fire. But the old scale was definitely too small, so I settled on a compromise. If we can't do a 1-to-1 scale, we'll work at a half scale, meaning our Senate building would have to be 1,000 blocks wide. And now that the final scale of the project was decided, I could finally paint in the surface of the city. I focused on filling in the areas around the executive office first to finish up the centerpiece of the build. This was the most annoying part of the surface painting, as I had to move buildings around and more carefully place them to avoid crossing over with the roads too much. But as the area began to fill out, it started to look really cool, and this is when the build first started to take shape. It took a good while to fill the area in, but once it was finished, it was looking incredible. But as I moved out to paint more areas of the city, the project finally started to make Minecraft suffer. Not only was I loading in hundreds of chunks at a time to make the process go as quickly as possible, but I was also painting in millions of blocks with one command, which my building server was not happy with. Sometimes I would push it too far and it would end up crashing my server, which would even roll back some of my building progress on occasion. It took a couple of days and there were more than a few server crashes, but finally the surface of Coruscant was painted in. While it did look really cool, right now it was just an enormous labyrinth of small buildings. There was still a lot missing before we could call this build complete. With step 1 finished, it was time to move on to the skyscrapers. While this step was a lot more straightforward and easier to understand than the surface, this one would end up taking a lot more time and effort. I had a 36 million block area to fill out with hundreds of skyscrapers, so you might be wondering how I'm possibly going to build that many. Well, I of course had another trick up my sleeve, a concept known as reusable assets. A lot of video games reuse a lot of their assets in multiple different spots to save on time. Breath of the Wild, for example, has ruin designs that are seen dozens of times across the game, and I planned to use this concept to fill out the city. I can reuse my skyscraper designs in multiple different spots across the world. Now, if I only built like 3 skyscrapers, it would be obvious that I'm reusing the same designs over and over again. But the more skyscrapers I build, the less obvious it becomes. And in case you think you would notice when assets are being reused like this, even Star Wars is doing it. There are reused assets in this screenshot that I just showed you earlier. So my plan was to build around 15 skyscrapers and apply them to Axiom's stamp tool to paint them across the city with the same method as the surface. I decided to break up my designs into 3 categories: larges, mediums, and smalls. And just to remind you of the insane scale of this project, I wanted the smallest of the buildings to be around 300 blocks tall, with the tallest being over 800 blocks. Just look at the size of that in a regular Minecraft world. I can barely fit it on my screen. I decided to start with the small structures before moving on to the big ones, so I pulled up this screenshot again and chose some designs to work on. Let's try out this one first. The image didn't give me a clear view of the building, so a lot of this design was up to my own interpretation. This building ended up being a darker gray color for the most part, but I would slowly move towards making the buildings brighter the more I built. Next, I built up their next door neighbor, which ended up being the weirdest of the designs that I made. Because this one was one of the first ones I made, I didn't have a style nailed down yet, so it ended up being one of the more unique buildings of the batch. This was also the first time I used the fairly new resin blocks, which I really didn't like these at first, but I've kinda grown fond of them. This wasn't the last time I would use this block during this project. As I hunted for more skyscraper designs to build, I found this template with a bunch of Coruscant building designs, and I liked a lot of them. I started with this one on the far left, but I would not blame you if you mistook this for the world's biggest jukebox. I was also taking care to add plenty of lighting to the exterior of these buildings to make them glow a bit at night. With these 3 buildings done, I decided the time was right to go up in scale and start building some of the medium-sized buildings. This building here would end up being one of my favorites of the entire batch despite its simple design. It also just reminds me of Transformers Armada, just like the whole thing. I don't know why, I haven't watched this show since I was a kid. Still using this screenshot as a reference, I built up our second medium skyscraper, which turned out alright, but not one of my favorites, before I immediately jumped into a different design that would also become one of my favorites. The black structures sticking out of the side of this building is a unique detail that I really enjoyed. This large cuboid building would be the last design I took from this screenshot before I moved on to finding different buildings to make. I set my eyes on this weird cone-shaped building next, but I accidentally gave the cone a 2-block center on my first attempt, which you just never want to do. Don't build on 2-block centers, kids, and stay in school. But I fixed it up on attempt 2 and gave it a real nice grid pattern on the bottom that I liked a lot. This next design was a simple one that I took from LEGO Star Wars, which was basically just a non-special filler building for the whole batch. Afterwards, I found another screenshot with multiple designs that I liked, specifically these two. The first one was a simple tower that acted as another bit of filler between the better designs, but this second skyscraper would turn out really nice. I love the segmented design here, and I think the simplicity fits super well for this structure. The final shading really brought it all together. At this point, we had 11 skyscrapers, coming pretty close to my goal of 15. So I decided it was time to take things up a notch and get into the large building designs. Skyscrapers that stretched over 600 blocks tall, buildings so massive that they would once again begin to crash my server as I tried to work on them. The first large building was pretty much a design of my own. I took very light inspiration from a screenshot, but I came up with most of it myself. However, I really didn't like how dark it was in the end, so I would have to redo it to make the color a lot lighter. Next, I took inspiration from this building scene here, and this one turned into the tallest skyscraper I would build for this project. The build limit on my server had already been extended to 800 blocks, but I reached this limit while building the skyscraper. Oh my god, this is build limit. This is the goddamn build limit. So I had to extend the height limit all the way up to 1,024 blocks, which is nearly triple the default height limit of Minecraft. And before you ask, yes, of course this behemoth crashed my server. Multiple times. Next, I took inspiration from these two buildings and ended up making one of the most stereotypical futuristic skyscrapers ever. But it looks cool, so whatever, I guess. Next up was Skyscraper 15, and for the final building, I looked at this enormous structure, but I didn't want to make mine quite that large. The structuring took a lot of time for this one, but luckily coloring it was quite trivial, and I somehow managed to get through this one without a server crash. I realized while making these skyscrapers that because this project was so massive, it was more like something you should stand back and admire from a distance than get up and close with. Which is why I haven't gotten super nitty-gritty with the tiny details, nor have I done interiors for this. But finally, all of the skyscrapers were complete, and I could start painting them across Coruscant. I painted the area around the executive office first, only using smaller designs here since I didn't want any massive skyscrapers to cover the view of the Senate building. But outside of the city center, I decided to place in larger, tighter clumps of buildings with the areas in between having a few scattered skyscrapers. It took a long while to fill out the city entirely, and I had to go through many more server crashes, and in the end, I had no idea if it looked good or not. I could barely load in a small percentage of the city, and I was playing at 150 render distance. The only way to see this build in full would be to download a mod like Distant Horizons, which is something I planned to do at the very end of the project. So we won't know if my plans worked until the very end. But for now, let's finally move on to Stage 3. It's finally time to build up the Jedi Temple. While I couldn't find any concrete map for where the temple is in relation to the Senate building, I knew that it was somewhere nearby in a secluded area with few skyscrapers. So I decided to build it down here in this quadrant. The outline for the temple was gigantic, but luckily the building is completely symmetrical, meaning that if I just built one corner of the build, I could copy and paste it to the other three corners to finish up the entire thing. Once the slanted walls were finished, I added other details to the structure before moving on to the roof. For some reason, the 5 towers up here gave me a lot of trouble, as they always looked either too small or too large compared to the rest of the temple. But I finally settled on a design after lots of nitpicking, and after that, we just had to add some proper colors to the temple. We went through a few ideas between lighter and darker colors, but having darker grays just didn't seem fitting for the Jedi Temple, so we ended up going a lot lighter with the colors. And in the end, I think it turned out really nice. Before we can move on to the final build of the city, that being the Senate building, I wanted to finish up some final details first. There are all kinds of speeders flying through Coruscant in most depictions of the city, so I wanted to add in a lot of these to make the city feel more alive. I copied down a few speeder designs from reference images that I found online, giving each design multiple different colors to add further variation to the collection. After 6 different designs with multiple different colors for each of them, I felt like I had enough for the city. I added in huge bedrock lines going across the entire length of Coruscant, and once again used Axiom's stamp tool to paste in the different speeders across the line, before removing the bedrock in the end to complete a single speeder lane. I added in a few different lanes going in each direction, but because of the way the stamp tool works, I would have to manually rotate all of the speeders that were facing east or west. I didn't want to spam a bunch of these everywhere to avoid overcrowding the build, so there weren't too many speeder lanes. But I did add a larger cluster of these speeders around the Jedi Temple. But for this location, I also wanted some Jedi starfighters flying around, so I got to work designing some of those. These were a ton of fun to make. These have always been some of my favorite Star Wars ships, and the designs were pretty challenging to replicate on this scale. It kind of makes me want to build the entire Battle of Coruscant in the skies above, complete with massive Venators and everything in between. I built a bunch of other Star Wars ships for fun, so if you got any ideas for more Star Wars builds, leave them down below and I might just build them. But with the starships done, I added them around the temple, and it was starting to look really complete. Finally, after almost 30 days of building, we had made it to the final part of the project, the Senate building. Stretching over 1,000 blocks in each direction, being over 500 blocks tall, I knew that this was going to be tough. Not on me, I knew I could handle it, I just wasn't sure if my server could handle even more crashes. After finding a couple of reference images, I got to work, moving the building into the sky to give myself more room to work with, before messing with the structure to make it more accurate. I wanted to add these large pillar-like structures first, which Axiom's shape tool made pretty simple. Once that was done, I began to design the sides of the building, which luckily weren't super complex. The bottom layer was mostly empty, and the middle layer had nothing but a bunch of windows, for which I used a bunch of redstone lamps, with some being on and some being off to simulate lights from the rooms inside. The top segment of the building had a bunch of these square-like shapes all around the diameter, which I thought were going to be very tough, but after learning some new Axiom tools, I was able to quickly finish them. With that, I just had to color in the Senate building, adding some gray shading to the main building with a large white gradient for the dome roof. And after giving the building a proper platform to sit on, I moved the building back down to the ground, an act that of course had to crash the server 2 more times because it just had to get a few more in for the road. After placing in large clusters of speeders around the Senate building, Coruscant was complete, and there was only one thing left to do. I spent literally 2 hours loading in the entire map with distant horizons, so that we could get a look at what it all looks like now that it's fully complete.